Chapter 10, The Dance of Desire. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, deadlines, and late nights, but despite the chaos, Simon was never far from Grace's thoughts. She tried to focus on work, on the myriad of tasks that demanded her attention, but every time she caught a glimpse of Simon, every time their eyes met across the conference room, she felt a spark of something electric, something undeniable. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was something deeper, something that stirred in her chest whenever she was near him. She had always prided herself on being in control, on keeping her emotions tightly reined in. But with Simon, that control was slipping, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. One evening, as the office began to empty out, Grace found herself staying late to finish a report. The building was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. She liked the stillness, the way it allowed her to focus without distraction. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice Simon standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat softly. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked, his voice low and warm in the silence of the office. Grace looked up, startled, but quickly composed herself. "Just finishing up a few things." "What about you?" Simon stepped into the room, a small smile playing on his lips. "Same. I figured I'd get ahead on a few projects." There was a moment of silence between them, a tension that hung in the air like the calm before a storm. Grace felt her heart begin to race, and she quickly turned back to her computer, trying to ignore the way Simon's presence made her pulse quicken. "Grace," Simon said after a moment, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "About the other day, when I asked you to dinner. I don't want you to feel pressured. I really enjoy spending time with you. And I'd like to get to know you better." Grace's fingers stilled on the keyboard. She felt the weight of his words, the sincerity behind them. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, the office around them seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of quiet intimacy. "I enjoy spending time with you too, Simon," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But things are complicated. You know that." Simon nodded, his expression serious. "I know. But I also think that sometimes, the things that are worth it are the ones that are the most complicated." Grace felt a flutter of something in her chest, hope, maybe, or desire. She knew Simon was right, but the fear of what might happen if they crossed that line still held her back. "Simon," she began, but he cut her off, stepping closer. "Grace, I know you're worried. And I understand why. But I'm not going anywhere. I want to take this slow, to figure things out together. I'm not asking for anything more than that." His words were a balm to her doubts, soothing the worry that had been gnawing at her for days. She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was the same warmth, the same gentle determination that had drawn her to him in the first place. Before she could stop herself, Grace nodded. "Okay. Let's take it slow. But Simon, I need you to be patient with me." Simon's smile was soft, understanding. "I'm in no rush, Grace. We'll go at your pace." The relief that washed over her was almost overwhelming. She smiled back at him, a genuine smile that felt like a release of all the tension that had been building inside her. "Thank you," she said softly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat in the room. Simon took another step closer, and this time, Grace didn't move away. There was a moment, a breathless, heart-stopping moment, where she thought he might kiss her. His eyes darkened, his gaze flicking to her lips, and she felt a shiver of anticipation run through her. But Simon didn't move, didn't close the remaining distance between them. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Dinner tomorrow night?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. Simon's thumb brushed over her knuckles in a tender gesture that sent warmth radiating through her. "Good night, Grace," he said softly, his voice carrying a promise that made her heart flutter. "Good night, Simon," she replied, her voice a little shaky but filled with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in a long time. As Simon left the room, Grace sat back in her chair, staring at the door long after it had closed behind him. She couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face, or the way her heart felt like it was soaring. For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to fall in love again. And this time, with Simon, she felt like it was a possibility worth exploring, slowly, carefully, but with an open heart. Click follow for the next chapters.